1:17 a.m. Andersen Air Force Base, Guam. 13 degrees north latitude, 144 degrees east longitude. The island is 48 kilometers long and 19 kilometers wide. It sits at the geographic center of the U.S. military's Western Pacific logistics architecture. 2,500 kilometers from Okinawa, 2,600 kilometers from Manila, 3,800 kilometers from Pearl Harbor, and 9,300 kilometers from the U.S. mainland. Every aircraft that flies a strike mission in the Western Pacific needs fuel. Every ship that fires a missile in the Philippine Sea needs replenishment. Every ground force positioned in the Ryukyus needs a supply chain that runs through or past the island's port and airfield complex. Guam is not a forward operating base. It is the forward operating base, the node on which every other node depends. The plan had understood this for 14 years. Its targeting doctrine referred to Guam as the second island chain anchor, the fixed geographic point that sustained the mobile force structure that would contest any Taiwan Strait operation. You could not remove the carrier groups from the Philippine Sea without removing Guam's ability to support them. And unlike a carrier group, Guam could not move. At 1:17 a.m., the plan committed its maximum Western Pacific rocket force allocation to a single target set, from 47 pre-surveyed launch positions across the Shandong and Jilin interior, positions that had been selected over 6 years of targeting refinement to provide the optimal ballistic approach geometry to Guam from ranges that minimized U.S. intercept window. The DF-26B intermediate range ballistic missile launch sequence began. The DF-26B has a range of 4,000 kilometers. From the interior launch positions, Guam sat at 2,700 to 3,100 kilometers range, well within the envelope, giving the plan launch flexibility to use approach angles that degraded the THAAD battery's engagement geometry. The plan's Guam targeting plan had been built around one central technical problem. The two THAAD batteries on Guam, networked through CEC, with 4 Aegis combatants positioned in the waters east and north of the island, represented a defensive architecture that had been specifically designed for exactly the DF-26B threat. Defeating it required not outpacing the system's intercept probability per engagement, but exceeding its total magazine capacity through volume. The THAAD battery carries 48 ready interceptors per fire unit, with 2 fire units per battery. Guam had 2 batteries, 192 THAAD interceptors in total ready load. Each Aegis combatant carried SM-3, Block 2A interceptors allocated to Guam BMD defense, a combined 96 SM-3 cells across the 4 ships. Total Guam BMD magazine at engagement start, 288 interceptors. The plan had launched 418 DF-26B missiles. The mathematics were intentional. 418 inbound ballistic missiles against 288 interceptors, assuming a 100% intercept rate per shot, which no system achieved in operational conditions, against the realistic 71% to 84% per shot intercept probability for SM-3 Block 2A and THAAD against DF-26B. The number of DF-26Bs that would survive to terminal phase was not a question of whether the defense would be saturated. It was a question of how many warheads would reach the island. But 418 DF-26Bs was not the full scope of what had activated at 1:17 a.m. From the Hainan Island submarine base and from patrol positions in the South China Sea, the second element of the operation had been positioning for 11 days. 4 Type 096 tank-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, China's newest SSN with improved acoustic quieting over the Type 093B, had been moving independently on courses that converged on a single geographic objective. The USNS Supply Convoy, currently transiting 340 kilometers southeast of Guam. The convoy consisted of 4 USNS dry cargo ships carrying ordnance, aviation fuel, and replacement VLS cells for the strike groups operating in the Philippine Sea. Escorted by one Arleigh Burke-class destroyer and one Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate. The Convoy was the island's replenishment lifeline. The Guam Defense Network could absorb an initial DF-26B salvo. It could not absorb a second salvo if the first salvo had degraded its intercept magazine to below operational threshold, and there was no resupply if the convoy did not arrive. The plan had not attempted to interdict U.S. logistics in the Western Pacific since the 1950s. The operations planners had spent 2 years on the legal, strategic, and operational dimensions of interdicting supply vessels. The political authorization for this element had been the most debated component of the plan. Striking non-combat logistics ships required a different political threshold than striking military combatants. The authorization had been granted with a specific restriction. Only ships confirmed to be carrying war materiel, not civilian vessels. The USNS ships were military logistics vessels. They qualified. The third element, 156 DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicles, launching from coastal positions in Fujian and Guangdong, targeting Andersen Air Force Base's runway complex, fuel farm, and munitions storage infrastructure. The DF-17 approach to Guam from the Fujian coast was 2,900 kilometers, placing it at the outer boundary of the weapon's designed range. The extended range reduced its terminal maneuvering authority. Less fuel remaining for terminal guidance meant a less aggressive maneuver profile. The THAAD and SM-6 engagement probability against the range-limited DF-17 was modeled at 61% to 73%, slightly higher than the optimal range engagement. Total first wave, 418 DF-26B ballistic missiles, 156 DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicles, 4 Type 096 submarines prosecuting the supply convoy. The most concentrated single-target strike package in plan operational history. 1:17 a.m. Guam Integrated Air and Missile Defense Operations Center. The SBIR's notification arrived at 1:17 a.m. The duty controller had been in this chair for 7 months. The elevated alert posture had been in effect for 12 days, and the intelligence assessment that had prompted it had been specific. The plan's rocket force had moved to a launch-ready posture at multiple interior sites, consistent with a Guam maximum effort scenario. The assessment had arrived 11 days earlier with a confidence interval of 82%. The controller had been briefed that 82% was as high as the system produced for this threat category. At 1:17 a.m., the SBIRS feed showed 47 simultaneous launch signatures across the Shandong and Jilin interior. She initiated the Guam IAMD's Mass Attack Response Protocol in 2.3 seconds. The protocol had been developed over 3 years specifically for a scenario where the total inbound count exceeded the available BMD magazine. Its core logic was triage. Not every DF-26B warhead had the same target value. The protocol's targeting algorithm prioritized intercept resource allocation by the assessed damage value of each weapon's projected impact point. Missiles projected to impact the runway complex received the highest intercept priority. Missiles projected to impact the fuel farm and munition storage received the second priority. Missiles projected to impact personnel areas and non-critical infrastructure received lower priority, but were not ignored. The protocol allocated minimum intercept resources to all impact zones to prevent the adversary from routing weapons around the defended zones. The protocol also incorporated a reload timeline calculation. Each THAAD battery's ready-load-reload cycle was 11 minutes. The protocol's engagement sequencing was designed to stagger each battery's expenditure so that one battery was always in reload while another was firing, preventing the simultaneous reload gap that had been the THAAD battery's critical vulnerability in the Korean Peninsula scenario. The lesson from that engagement had been written into the Guam Protocol 18 months earlier. First intercepts began at 1:23 a.m., 6 minutes after launch, as the DF-26B's mid-course phase entered the THAAD and SM-3 engagement envelopes. The combined BMD network processed 418 inbound tracks simultaneously under CEC. The Aegis ships SM-3 Block 2A engaged the higher altitude mid-course trajectories at ranges beyond THAAD's optimal geometry. The THAAD batteries engaged the terminal phase tracks as they descended into Guam's protected airspace. The engagement cascade ran continuously for 23 minutes. The window between first mid-course intercept and last terminal phase intercept, as the slower trajectory DF-26Bs completed their flight times. Of 418 DF-26B missiles, 296 were intercepted across the combined SM-3 and THAAD network. A combined intercept rate of 70.8%, slightly below the model's lower bound, attributable to the volume-induced engagement sequencing friction that occurred when all 4 Aegis ships and both THAAD batteries were simultaneously at maximum engagement rate. When every system fires as fast as it can, the targeting solution quality for each individual engagement drops marginally. Across 418 engagements, that marginal degradation accumulated into an outcome 0.8% below the minimum modeled rate. 122 DF-26B warheads survived to terminal phase against Guam. Of those 122, the protocol's triage logic had allocated remaining interceptors to the highest priority impact zones. Patriot PAC-3MSE engaged the terminal phase survivors across 6 battery positions distributed around the island. 47 additional warheads were intercepted by PAC-3MSE. 75 impacted. Of 75 impacts, 19 struck the Andersen runway complex in 3 impact clusters. Both primary runways received at least 4 direct hits each. Andersen Air Force Base's flight operations were suspended. The runway repair assessment: primary runway operational in 6 hours, secondary runway in 4 hours. The repair crews had been pre-positioned under the elevated alert protocol. They were on the surfaces within 7 minutes of the last impact. 28 impacts struck the fuel farm complex. 4 of the farm's 9 fuel storage capacity sections were rendered non-operational. Andersen's fueling operations were reduced to 41% of normal throughput capacity. 11 impacts struck the munitions storage complex. 2 storage bunkers sustained direct structural hits. 17 impacts were distributed across non-critical infrastructure areas. Andersen was not eliminated. It was severely degraded across all 3 functional categories: runway, fuel, and munitions. It would be restored to minimum operational capacity within 6 hours. Full operational capacity restoration was assessed at 72 hours. The DF-17 package presented a different problem. At 1:29 a.m., as the DF-26B engagement was still running at maximum rate, 156 DF-17 tracks began appearing in the SM-6 and THAAD engagement envelope from the western approach vector. The BMD network was simultaneously managing terminal phase DF-26B intercepts and mid-course DF-17 engagements, 2 separate threat classes at 2 separate altitude bands, requiring 2 separate interceptor types running simultaneously. The THAAD battery reload stagger protocol, designed to prevent both batteries from reloading simultaneously, was still functioning. Battery A was in reload when the DF-17 tracks appeared. Battery B continued engaging. Battery A came back online at 1:31 a.m. The 2-minute window where Battery A was in reload had allowed 9 DF-17S to pass through the THAAD engagement zone without being assigned an interceptor. They were picked up by the SM-6 layer from USS Lake Erie and USS Chancellorsville. 7 were intercepted. 2 continued to terminal phase. Both were engaged by PAC-3MSE. 1 was neutralized. 1 impacted the Andersen radar facility at 1:34 a.m., disabling the AN/TPY-2 forward-based radar that had been providing early warning tracking data for the BMD network. The loss of the AN/TPY-2 radar degraded the engagement network's tracking accuracy for the final 31 DF-17s in the package, reducing the SM-6 engagement probability from 68% to 54% for the remaining engagements. Of 156 DF-17s, 94 intercepted by SM-6 and THAAD combined. 23 intercepted by PAC-3MSE. 39 reached impact. Of those 39, 11 struck Andersen's already damaged runway complex. 6 struck communication relay infrastructure. 9 struck the port facilities at Opera Harbor. 13 struck non-critical areas. By minute 31 of the combined engagement, the United States had expended $3.8 billion in BMD interceptors and related costs. The figure represented the largest single-operation BMD expenditure in U.S. military history. It had been incurred in defense of a 48-kilometer island. It had not fully stopped the damage. It had degraded the damage from catastrophic to severe. Andersen Air Force Base, operationally degraded across runway, fuel, munitions, and now radar. Opera Harbor, pier infrastructure damaged, port operations at reduced capacity. The combined effect on Guam's ability to sustain operations in the Western Pacific, assessed at 31% of pre-engagement throughput capacity. Not zero. Not sufficient for the surge operations that a Taiwan Strait scenario would require. The convoy interdiction developed simultaneously 340 kilometers to the southeast. The 4 Type 096 submarines had positioned themselves across the convoy's projected transit route during the preceding 11 days. The convoy's Arleigh Burke escort, USS Fitzgerald, had been conducting standard anti-submarine warfare screening ahead of the convoy formation. But the Type 096's improved acoustic quieting had kept it below the passive detection threshold of the convoy's screening assets. At 1:22 a.m., 5 minutes after the DF-26B launch, while the Guam BMD network was fully engaged with its intercept sequence, the Type 096 submarines activated. The choice of timing was deliberate. The MH-60R helicopters that would normally augment the convoy's anti-submarine warfare screening had been recalled to Guam 9 days earlier to pre-position for the Guam defensive operation. The convoy had entered the transit window with 1 destroyer, 1 frigate, and no organic airborne ASW support. The Type 096 commanders had known this for 7 days, transmitted by a plan intelligence collection asset tracking the convoy's composition. From ranges between 12 and 22 kilometers, the 4 submarines launched a combined 24 YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles against the convoy formation at 1:22 a.m. Their missile packages were allocated: 9 YJ-18 against USNS Matthew Perry, the largest dry cargo vessel in the convoy carrying the replacement VLS cells; 7 against USNS Washington Chambers, carrying aviation fuel; 5 against USNS William McLean, carrying ordnance; 3 against USS Fitzgerald. The convoy formation had no radar track of the submarines. The YJ-18's subsonic cruise phase gave the Fitzgerald's SPY 1 radar 9 minutes from first detection to terminal impact. In a standard fleet engagement, 9 minutes with an Aegis ship is sufficient for SM-6 or ESSM engagement of multiple inbound missiles. A single Arleigh Burke, with a convoy formation to coordinate, managing 24 simultaneous inbound tracks, was at the edge of its individual engagement capacity without CEC support from other Aegis platforms. Fitzgerald was alone. She fired 14 SM-6 against the inbound YJ-18 package between 1:24 a.m. and 1:29 a.m. Of 24 YJ-18s, 13 were intercepted by SM-6. The remaining 11 entered the inner defense perimeter. ESSM and CIWS engaged. 6 were neutralized. 5 impacted. USNS Matthew Perry received 2 YJ-18 impacts. The VLS cells in her cargo hold were not armed. They were inert units in transport configuration. The detonation of the YJ-18's 300-kilogram warhead against the cargo hold produced a fire in the storage area. The fire spread to adjacent cargo. The ship was not immediately sunk, but was assessed as non-survivable without emergency assistance within 4 hours. USNS Washington Chambers received one YJ-18 impact on her aviation fuel section. The fuel did not detonate. Aviation fuel in pressurized tankage does not ignite from a single warhead impact without an oxygen mixture event. The structural damage was sufficient to rupture 2 of her 5 fuel tanks. She was taking on water and fuel simultaneously, the fuel leak creating a surface contamination pattern that the Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigate, USS Reuben James, could not approach for rescue operations. USNS William McLean received 2 impacts. Her ordnance cargo did detonate. The detonation was catastrophic. USNS William McLean was assessed as lost at 1:31 a.m. USS Fitzgerald received no impact. The 3 YJ-18S targeting the destroyer had all been included in her 13 SM-6 and ESSM intercepts. The prioritized allocation of her defensive resources had correctly identified her own survivability as the prerequisite for protecting the convoy assets. The 4 Type 096 submarines had fired and were maneuvering to evade. At 1:27 a.m., the P-8 Poseidon that had been conducting standard barrier patrol east of Guam received an emergency retasking order to support the convoy's anti-submarine warfare. The P-8 was 280 kilometers from the convoy's position, 28 minutes of transit time. By the time it arrived, the Type 096 submarines had dispersed into the deep water southeast of the engagement area. 2 of the 4 were localized by the P-8's acoustic buoy barriers over the following 4 hours. Both were engaged and assessed as non-operational by 5:44 a.m. 2 remained unlocalized. The desperation gambit came not from the rocket force, but from the convoy engagement's aftermath. At 2:04 a.m., as the BMD network was completing its post-engagement assessment and the convoy damage was being reported to Pacific Fleet Command, the PLAN activated a second DF-26B salvo from the same launch positions. 44 missiles, not 418. The rocket force's ready inventory for the Guam target set had been largely expended. 44 were what remained after the maximum effort first salvo. The second salvo was not aimed at Andersen's already damaged facilities. It was aimed at the Guam BMD network itself, specifically at the AN/TPY-2 radar positions, the THAAD battery launcher sites, and the Aegis ship positions that had been providing BMD support. A defensive network degraded by the first salvo was a defensive network more vulnerable to the second. Spears detected the second launch at 2:04 a.m. The Guam IAMD Operations Center's BMD magazine had been reduced by the first engagement to approximately 31% of its pre-engagement load across all system types. The 44 incoming DF-26Bs were assigned to the remaining interceptors under the same triage protocol. But with 31% of the original magazine, the intercept capacity against 44 DF-26Bs was 31 interceptors at reduced confidence. Of 44 second salvo DF-26Bs, 29 were intercepted. 15 reached terminal phase. PAC-3 MSE engaged 9. 6 impacted. 3 impacted in the THAAD battery operational areas. The launcher infrastructure sustained structural damage from fragmentation effects. Both THAAD batteries were assessed as degraded to below operational status pending damage assessment and repair. The Guam BMD network's primary intercept layer had been eliminated for a period assessed at 48 to 72 hours for reconstitution. 3 additional impacts struck Andersen's partially repaired runway areas, resetting portions of the repair timeline. By 2:34 a.m., the Guam Integrated Air and Missile Defense Operations Center had completed its initial post-engagement assessment. The assessment was transmitted to Pacific Fleet Command and to the Secretary of Defense simultaneously. Andersen Air Force Base, operationally degraded. Both THAAD batteries, non-operational pending repair. Apra Harbor, reduced capacity. USNS William McLean, lost. USNS Matthew Perry, non-survivable crew evacuation in progress. USNS Washington Chambers, damaged, proceeding at reduced speed. Guam's combined warfighting support capacity, assessed at 19% of pre-engagement throughput capability. Not zero, 19%. The island had not been neutralized. An island with 19% throughput capacity could still sustain limited operations. It could receive emergency VLS reloads. It could fuel aircraft at reduced rates. It could provide command and control functions that did not depend on the damaged facilities. What it could not do was sustain the surge operational tempo that a Taiwan Strait scenario's first 72 hours required. The plan's operational requirement had not been the elimination of Guam. It had been the reduction of Guam to below the surge threshold. The 19% assessment was below that threshold. 4:02 a.m. Andersen Air Force Base, runway repair staging area. The repair crew chief had been coordinating the first runway repair sequence since 1:52 a.m., 11 minutes after the last DF-26B impact, when the all-clear had been transmitted for the impact zones. Her team had completed the first impact crater fill and was halfway through the second when the second salvo struck at 2:09 a.m., resetting portions of the runway she had already repaired. She assessed the new damage at 2:11 a.m., transmitted a revised timeline to the Base Operations Center, and redirected her team to the new impact clusters. The revised assessment: primary runway operational in 8 hours from the second salvo's last impact. Secondary runway in 5. At 4:02 a.m., she transmitted an intermediate repair milestone. The secondary runway's first impact cluster had been filled, and the surface assessed as load-bearing at 12,000 kilograms maximum wheel load. Limited operations could begin on the secondary runway. Limited, not surge. She logged the milestone and moved to the next cluster. Time from first DF-26, B launch detection, to last second salvo impact. 52 minutes. Time from first convoy YJ, 18 impact to USNS William McLean loss assessment, 9 minutes. First wave results: 418 DF-26, B launched. 296 intercepted by SM-3 and THAAD, 47 by PAC-3MSE. 75 impacted Guam. 156 DF-17 launched. 117 intercepted, 39 impacted. Combined intercept rate, first wave, 73.7% across both missile categories. Second wave results: 44 DF-26B launched, 29 intercepted, 15 terminal phase, 9 PAC-3MSE intercepts, 6 impacted. Both THAAD batteries degraded to non-operational status. Convoy results: USNS William McLean, lost. USNS Matthew Perry, non-survivable evacuation. USNS Washington Chambers, damaged, proceeding. USS Fitzgerald, undamaged, combat effective. U.S. personnel, 23 service members killed across Andersen impact zones from direct warhead effects during the runway repair pre-positioning operations that had begun before the second salvo. 41 injured across Guam military facilities. 11 killed aboard USNS William McLean. Counterstrike: 164 Tomahawks from pre-positioned Virginia-class submarines in the Philippine Sea engaged PLARF launch complex surface infrastructure. Beginning at 1:44 a.m. under Operation IRON MERIDIAN. B-2 strikes against Rocket Force command and control infrastructure, authorized at 2:19 a.m. 2 of 4 Type 096 submarines engaged by P-8 and assessed as non-operational by 5:44 a.m. Total BMD interceptors expended: 351 across all system types, representing 71.3% of Guam's pre-engagement magazine. Total engagement cost including counterstrike, $4.1 billion. The plan had committed its maximum Western Pacific Rocket Force allocation, to a single geographic objective and had achieved the reduction it needed. Guam at 19% throughput capacity. It had not eliminated the island. It had reduced it below the surge threshold the Taiwan Strait scenario's operational timeline required. The margin between 19% and 0 was the margin between a degraded logistics hub and a neutralized one. The plan had calculated it needed the latter. The U.S. defense had delivered the former. The 73.7% intercept rate across 574 first-wave weapons was the highest combined BMD intercept rate the system had ever achieved against a single mass attack event. It had not been sufficient to prevent the outcome the plan's planners had specified as the minimum acceptable result. That calculation, the gap between what the defense could achieve and what the offense needed the defense to fail to achieve, was the number that every U.S. defense planner would study, model, and attempt to close in the years following this engagement. Andersen's secondary runway had limited operations at 4:02 a.m. The repair crews were still working. The budget review would be scheduled for Monday,